Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Wakefield, a rising senior at Occidental College, and today I'm going to be talking you through the philosophy research I completed this summer entitled Aesthetics of the Body, Beauty and Worth. In this talk, I'll begin by discussing the foundations of aesthetics and beauty in philosophy. It's super important to have this historical context in order to understand the work that contemporary thinkers are responding to. Next, I'll discuss what those modern philosophers have said in response to and in addition to the canon. And finally, I will lead you through the current understandings of how to determine aesthetic worth and beauty in terms of the body and strategies to address the very often socially and culturally oppressive consequences of such bodily judgments. We'll begin with Plotinus, who was a prominent Hellenistic philosopher. For him and the majority of his contemporaries, beauty was accomplished by adherence to a perfect form. So, in basic terms, this means that if things are beautiful if they follow logical patterns and rules and are not randomly composed. So, beauty itself is an objective state determined by a standard of perfection, but the response to it is an emotional one of love and longing. Moving to the late 18th century, we reach David Hume, who is the author of The Standard of Taste and probably one of the most referenced philosophers when discussing beauty and aesthetics. To him, the ability to experience beauty is a subjective practice, but there are good and bad judgments of taste. So bad judgments are made by those people who have superficial or external influences and biases, and the determinant of a good judgment is its ability to withstand the test of time. So those judgments are reached by people who have no relevant biases and remain acceptable over the course of history. Finally, we move to Immanuel Kant, who is most likely the most well-known early 19th century philosopher. And for Kant, the ability to experience beauty remains subjective, but the feeling of pleasure that we may get from something does not necessarily equate to an aesthetic judgment of its beauty. Instead, he makes claims towards intersubjective validity through a demand that is very similar to his view on ethical judgments, and that the judgment itself is subjective, but for that judgment to be correct, everyone should reach the same conclusion. As you can see, all three of these philosophers adhere to a standardized view on beauty and aesthetic judgment. While Plotinus does give us a description of what beauty should look like visually, and even though Hume and Kant don't really offer the same kind of visual description, their views are founded on the need of a common consensus, which again demands some kind of standard. So now that we've established the relevant background on aesthetic judgments of beauty, we can take up the question of the body and its aesthetic relevance. Off the bat, a very common theme for contemporary body aesthetics is a total rejection of everything that I just talked you through. So the rejection of tradition works to counteract the question of subjective versus objective, since the alignment of aesthetic judgment and objectivity is pretty inherently exclusionary. Those bodies which are excluded and therefore fall outside of the realm of aesthetic beauty are typically those which are not white, athletic, or able-bodied, and contemporary aesthetics takes up the process of unlearning those kind of naturalized aesthetic judgments that are rooted in the philosophical tradition by means of an intersectional lens that aims to broaden the category of beautiful. So while aesthetics and the body are interesting to think about it theoretically, acceptance as beautiful in terms of physical appearance is truly anything but superficial. Racism, fat phobia, discrimination against disabled people, and a host of other oppressive practices are at least in part due to so-called aesthetic preference. Therefore, instead of a strict value system that bodies can be counted in or out of, contemporary philosophy aims to explore the different values that each body presents or has. Therefore, every body has value, and while worthy qualities may overlap from person to person, there's something uniquely valuable about the individual. Moving on to the current popular theory regarding aesthetics of the body, we can start with a discussion of subjectivity and objectivity, which we have been talking about. But for me, there's something pretty puzzling about whether there truly can be a standard of beauty for the body, and if there could be, then what its use would be or its purpose. So I found the most helpful answer to this question in Paul C. Taylor's Black is Beautiful through his discussion of somaesthetics, which details the internal experience of having a body, known as embodiment. And your embodiment naturally informs the way that you make judgments about others' bodies, and therefore those judgments cannot ever truly be objective. And as Taylor says in the chapter, How to Love Black Bodies While Hating Black People, the genealogical approach to aesthetic judgments is located in, quote, a polyhedron of intelligibility bounded by political economy, cultural symbolism, local social histories, ideologies of sexual propriety, evolving scientific accounts of human difference, and the way and degree to which scientific accounts get shared with the public, unquote. So the factors that inform our judgments of ourselves and others are so numerous that objectivity is basically a moot point. Another major component of our aesthetic judgments focuses on both the form and function of the body. The traditional definition of a proper form and function totally excludes any differently abled bodies. Toby Cybers, a modern philosopher who specializes in disability aesthetics, rejects this devaluation of non-standard bodies and positions disability aesthetics as a critical framework for questioning our aesthetic prejudices. A disabled body, in whatever form and in any manner that it functions, is a beautiful body both aesthetically and for its ability to circumvent a standard that is constantly evolving through time. So while certain aesthetic preferences fall in and out of favor, a body that is differently abled is afforded a timelessness that is not subject to superficial judgments. The final key component of body aesthetics is focused on inherent worth. As with most subcategories of aesthetic judgments, inherent value or worth is again tied to subjectivity and objectivity. But as I've outlined in the previous two subtopics, it's impossible to be fully objective, and therefore adherence to a standard is basically a meaningless endeavor. However, I also mentioned that contemporary philosophy, particularly Black and disability aesthetics, as I was just talking about, makes clear that every body does have worth, and that such worth is not determinable by consensus. This leads us to strategies for embracing our own body's value and combating the naturalized biases that enforce the oppression detailed by the traditional standard. The impacts that our aesthetic judgments, often hidden under the guise of aesthetic preference, have on other people are incredibly harmful, both in terms of internal factors such as self-esteem and self-worth, and externally in our everyday interactions and practices. For example, as philosopher Deborah Rode describes in her piece, Appearance as a Feminist Issue, more than 60% of overweight women report discrimination both in the workplace and in the hiring process. So-called pretty privilege functions to uphold systems of oppression that deny access to social, cultural, and economic success and benefits on the basis of conformity to the prevailing standard. Therefore, the first strategy to combat these biases, many of which are implicit because of their historical longevity and subsequent naturalization, is simply a widespread effort of exposure to a variety of bodies. Secondly, we must increase awareness of the fact that what we may consider to be basic aesthetic preference likely stems from the internalization of these classic thought patterns that require a specific standard. The presence of different bodies, coupled with the realization that an aesthetic standard is an outdated concept that propagates oppression, should begin to mitigate the effects of this system. The final strategy for personal growth is called aesthetic exploration and was introduced by Sherry Irvin in her piece Resisting Body Oppression: An Aesthetic Approach. She defines it as a disposition to seek out an object's particular aesthetic affordances and to enjoy them, by means of a very careful examination of the body, without focusing on whether you perceive it as beautiful or ugly, but instead making note of all of the unique patterns, textures, and details that make your body what it is. Over time, aesthetic exploration, when approached with a willingness to explore and have a sense of adventure, as well as with an effort to cognitively release positive aesthetic responses that occur as a result of the body's alignment with convention, will cultivate an attitude of appreciation towards both our own bodies and other people's bodies that isn't grounded in social and cultural influences. So, in conclusion, since aesthetic judgments founded in the oppressive tradition of classic philosophy spur real-world negative impacts, contemporary body aesthetics seeks to deconstruct that oppression through the promotion of justice for those bodies which have been excluded and discriminated against. Aesthetic exploration, consciousness raising, and increased exposure to those that deviate from the standard are some of the practical solutions modern philosophers employ to achieve equality. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. My works cited are on the next page.